I'm in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. I'm going to spend some time reviewing in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 between verses 19 and 23. Spend some time looking at these verses a little bit more. Beginning in verse 19, Paul says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you." So I'm going to spend some more time in these verses where Paul is talking about reaching out to other people. What he does is he makes a division between really the Jew and the Gentile. Those who are Jews, those who are not Jews, those who live by the Mosaic law, and those who do not live by the Mosaic law. He makes a division between the two, but then he presents the importance of realizing that it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all. Now remember that Paul started out in rabbinical Judaism. That was his background. His bondage, the life of bondage that he had, was to the Mosaic law, that he was bound to try to live in obedience to the commandments that God presented through Moses. And in his devotion, in his determination to do that, he would have a sense of accountability, not just to God, but also to others, where others would be observing him, asking him questions, see how he's doing, asking him things like, "Well, so tell me, brother, how you doing with your sin?" Something like that. And he would be accountable to other people in terms of how he is living his life as part of living by the Mosaic law, just in order to ensure that he is compliant, at least to other people's satisfaction. When it comes to a life of religion, it is not usually useful unless a person has someone else to compare themselves with. And so a lot of these kinds of accountability questions and discussions can come to the surface, especially as people will be relating to one another. But it's also valuable as people are able to compare themselves with those who are not as religious as they are. And of course, the majority of people who were Jews living in the land of Israel were not devoting their lives to the Mosaic law. That was not the case. It's never been the case. Those who are will be recognized a little bit more, and so there can be the impression that there's a lot more of that going on than there really was. But Paul was in this. This was part of his life. When he got saved, it took some time for him to adjust to the new reality of living by the new covenant. It didn't happen just overnight. It took him some time to make some adjustments and discover the implications of what Christ Jesus had done for him. And he eventually came to terms with the fact, he came to recognize that he was in fact free from the law because of what Christ did for him. He was not set free by God from trying to live a life that he couldn't for the purpose of now being able to go out and just indulge his flesh. That was not the purpose through which Christ set people free. He was set free so that he could walk in the newness of life and live by the inheritance that had been given to him according to the will of God that went into effect after Jesus died. There's a lot to this, of course. But he was learning to live by the inheritance in Christ, learning to live by what had been given to him, rather than trying to live a life trying to be obedient to God so that he could get something from God. So instead of living his life in obedience with hope that he would be blessed, he will now be blessed and then live according to the blessings that he has received. This was a transition for Paul, just like it is for everybody else, if people ever even make it that far. But this is the kind of freedom that he experienced. He was free not only from the Mosaic law, but he was free from the life of bondage, of religious bondage that he had placed himself under. And he was free from others who may pass judgment against him for not living in the way that they would expect him to live. All right? So this is the kind of freedom that I think that he was subtly referring to in verse 19, when he said, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all that I might win the more." He is now going to use his freedom not for the indulgence of his flesh, but so that he is more able to reach out to others, to be of service to others. And what was the service? What was the reaching out? Reaching out for what? With what? The gospel, the good news of what God has done for us, and the invocation of the new covenant, that people might be saved. That was what he decided to use his freedom for. He is now free from being preoccupied with himself, so that he is more able to reach out to others and contribute to the lives of others. And this was important to him. He decided to do this. In using his freedom in this way, he contributed to the lives of a lot of people, and a lot of people got saved, and a lot of people had a profound change in their life, but obviously not everyone, just some. Some out of the great many who he came in contact with benefited from the freedom that he had to be a representative of God, that others might know their God as he knew his God, as he knows his God. Okay? Now, in speaking about the Jews and the Gentiles, those who are under the law versus those who are not under the law, in speaking of those in this way, he is free to be able to relate to both the Jew and the Gentile. And of course, the emphasis here is going to be placed a little bit more on the Gentile from his perspective, because as a Jew, he was, of course, free, and he had lots of accessibility to those who wanted to live by the law, to live under the law. He already had plenty of access to those folks, but to reach out to the Gentiles, this could be a little bit more complicated, because if you are going to live your life according to Pharisaical Judaism, it's a challenge to connect with and form extensive relationships with other people who do not. That's just part of living by rabbinical Judaism. It's a default. It's just the side effect, the consequence related to being devoted to that way of life. It will isolate you from those who are not. Okay? So being free from the law, because of what Jesus did for him and because of the new covenant that he now lives by, he is now free, more free, to reach out to those who are not under the Mosaic law. So it's a way of saying that he has more accessibility to the Gentiles than he had before. There could, of course, be some access, but not as much as there can be when he doesn't have to be occupied with the rabbinical Judaism and all the details related to that, which would make it challenging and could interfere with his ability to be effective with communicating with the Gentiles. Even something as simple as just sitting down and having a meal with somebody, because of course you have to live by the dietary laws, and if you're going to do that with sincerity, all right, according to the way that the laws are described related to that, this is not likely going to happen. So when you are trying to relate to other people who don't live by the Mosaic law, and you are living by the Mosaic law, and you let them know that you are, what you're effectively expressing to them is they need to consider that if they are going to be saved, well, then they're going to have to change their lifestyle and their diet, their diet, the way of eating and stuff. They're going to have to alter that to the way that you are if they're going to be right with God, because that's how you live. And these are the kinds of things that can become obstacles, or they can become attractive depending upon the person. But most people, this tends to be an obstacle with regards to why would they want to enter into a covenant when that's the kind of change that would need to be invoked. That's the kind of change required in order to pursue that. So when Paul is not bound by that and he does not live by that amongst those who do not either, he is free to reach out to them and reach out to them where they are, in the condition that they are in, related to who they are, instead of just trying to turn them into somebody who they are not. When reaching out to the Jews, he is free to live by the Mosaic law. He can do that. There's no condemnation because he obeys the commandments of God. But that's much easier than making the adjustment to realize that you can spend time with those who are not and still be able to reach out to them effectively. Okay, so what he's doing is he's talking about reaching out to people in the condition that they are in, where they are, because you have an objective to deal with the issues of the Spirit and not the issues of the flesh. From verse 20, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20, he says, "And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law." Right? So what is he saying? He's saying that when he went to the Jews, those who live by Pharisaical Judaism, again, it's not all Jews, but those who were, when he would go and he would spend time with them, then he would adjust how he was relating to them and how he was interacting with them. He would make an adjustment so that he would also live under the law and under the lifestyle that was similar, if not the same, as what they were doing, so that they would not be disoriented, distracted, or offended by him not doing so. Okay, so he was not going there to provoke any Jew to not live like a Jew anymore. It wasn't about that. It didn't matter. This is important to understand. It does not matter if a person is living by the law or not. It doesn't matter, because he's wanting them to be saved. And being saved is not about what your flesh is doing or what you're doing with your flesh. And so it doesn't matter. And because it doesn't matter, don't make it an issue. Just adjust, adapt, because you want to spend time with these people. So he would do that, and through that he would have access to them. And from there, he can convey to them the new covenant, the better way, by asking questions even. Just to give you an example, he can ask questions such as, what do you think about the spiritual death of humanity that happened with Adam and Eve? When the Holy Spirit of God departed from within Adam and Eve because they did not believe God and they ate from the wrong tree. What do you think about that? What do you think about the loss of the Holy Spirit? What do you suppose is going to be the solution to that kind of a problem? And of course, in rabbinical Judaism, we say that the solution is you're born a Jew. Okay, if you're born a Jew, then by default, you are born with the Holy Spirit of God within you, and that's the solution. I know it might sound a little odd to you, but that's what people believe. Okay, I've had lots of conversations with lots of rabbis who were devoted to Orthodox Pharisaical Judaism, and that's a common question that I would ask, and that's always the same answer. Well, when you're born Jewish, you're born spiritually alive. And then I could follow it up with, well, what do you really base that on? What do you think about? What do you really think that that's true? Really? I could follow up with a conversation about that and ask them really about their convictions concerning this. And then I would mention that, did you know that this is what Jesus came to address, that this is really what he was talking about when he was talking with people, is about solving this problem. Did you know that he had a different way of solving this problem? What do you think about this other way that Jesus described that he thinks is the right way to address this issue? Okay, so when you are reaching out to people like that, you don't go there pretending to be someone or being someone, pretending to be someone that you're not, or being someone that is going to offend them. All right, be practical and be honest and sincere. But to understand that the objective is not to try to figure out how to say, living by the law is useless. That's just not going to have any relevance. It's about salvation. What is the gospel? What was the problem between man and God? What was the solution? You can ask questions such as, tell me about the God that you know. What do you really know about your God personally? What do you think that he thinks about some of these things maybe going on in our current events in the world? How does he feel about this or that? These are ways of introducing conversation. And if they don't have much to say, or even if they do, then there can be an opportunity to move a person in the direction of, well, maybe you don't know him very well. All right, and why would that be? And you can go back to the spiritual death issue. And the reason why you don't really know him very well is because you just don't know him very well. And it could be because this is a way of understanding that you're spiritually dead. And this is a solution that he has provided, the solution of what the Messiah came to accomplish. So reaching out to Jews is the same as reaching out to a Gentile, just tailor fit to the topics and issues that may be of importance to them. To a Gentile, you probably wouldn't even have a discussion about what do you suppose God thinks about this. Instead, you could ask a question such as, have you noticed that you just don't know who God is? You could just go right to that right away. That won't offend Gentiles in general. It can offend a Jew, but it won't usually offend a Gentile. All right, so understand that the objective is to communicate the gospel, that a person might be saved. And it won't matter if a person is living by the law or if they are not living by the law, because all of that has to do with the behavior of the flesh. It doesn't have anything to do with the condition of a person's spirit and whether or not they have a relationship with their God. It has no relevance to those things. And so you can adapt, and you should adapt as is necessary in order to reach out to people, if that's what you're going to do, to reach out to people. All right, so again, in verse 20, and to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. And then in verse 21, to those who are without law, as without law. And then we have in parentheses in this translation, not being without law toward God, but under law towards Christ, which is a way of saying that you can still live in a way that you're not living according to Pharisaical Judaism and still not sin. It's not the same. To say that you're living without the law does not automatically mean that you're living for the indulgence of the flesh. It doesn't automatically mean that. To those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God. Okay, that I might win those who are without law. Verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now, I'd like to speak a little bit about this issue in verse 22 of reaching out to those who are weak. Okay, now this does not mean that there's something negative about a person being relatively weak. That doesn't mean there's something negative about that. It's just a way of understanding that some people have a little bit of a stronger personality, deeper convictions than other people have. They don't have such a strong personality. They don't have such deep convictions, or at least they don't let you know. they kind of keep it to themselves. Maybe they're a little bit deceptive and they're skilled at being able to hide these things. And I could suggest that in many cases that's true. But still, the idea here is to say that if a person is not a person of deep conviction, of personal strength in some way, do not be a bully in this person's life. Okay, don't go and just bully a person thinking that you're just going to get into that person's life and through your overbearing personality, they're going to submit and believe the gospel. Okay, this is not usually useful. Okay, because people need to believe out of a deep sense of conviction and decision from the innermost part of their being, from themselves, from their heart, from what's important to them, not because they've been bullied into it or intimidated in some way or provoked. To the weak, be as the weak. Reach out to them in a way that you are not bullying them, you're not provoking them, you're not confronting them in a way that makes them, intimidated or in some way bullied into just simply conforming to whatever it is that you're trying to get them to conform to, because that's just not going to be genuine. All right? There won't be anything genuine about that at all. When you disappear, when you're not there, then they'll just go back to however they really are. And when you show up, oh yeah, we'll just make it easy because I don't want to go through the effort of having some kind of conflict or disagreement or whatever. This is how people will live their lives and relate to each other. And so understand that this is perfectly fine, and reach and understand the person with whom you are speaking. All right? Understand the person you are reaching out to, and reach out to them in a way that will be effective in whatever condition that they are in. All right? I'm going to give you an example of how I reached out to some folks a long time ago. When I was spending a lot more time going out and being involved in other people's lives in the context of evangelism and reaching out to lost people in person. There was a Messianic congregation that was meeting on Friday evenings, and at that time in my life, I had some extra time during the evenings and the weekends, and so I would go out and I'd meet with people who were meeting on Friday evenings, sometimes on Saturdays. But in this case, it was a Messianic congregation, which means you have a group of people who are kind of sort of wanting to live by the Mosaic law. They are wanting to have a ceremonial service where they assemble together and then they have a ritualistic ceremony kind of experience that they believe is similar to what people would be doing in Judaism in ancient times during the time of Christ. All right, that they had the belief that people would get together on Friday evenings in a type of synagogue and that there was a certain ceremonial service that they would go through. And so these people were trying to recreate what they believed was going on and to encourage one another to live more according to the Mosaic law. And this would be an example where they are going to observe the Sabbath, all right, being from Friday evening until Saturday evening to worship God and to be obedient to the Sabbath law. And then, of course, they would add some more laws that seem to be convenient. The dietary laws is always added to groups of people like this. But they did this. This was their thing. And so I would go. I went. And I would hang out with the people. I would just be among the congregation and talk with folks about their faith and their interests and look for ways to communicate the gospel effectively. And this went on for many months, that I would just go and just be a part of the congregation, and I would relate to them and be like a Jew. I would do that, which I was free to do so. Okay, I was free to do that as a member of the congregation and to just become kind of a part of the community. I, of course, never compromised any of my personal beliefs, but I was free to participate in various things. Well, what they really like to do is close out their service by reciting the Aaronic blessing, which is, of course, perfectly fine. And they had a little note card that had the Aaronic blessing transliterated, which means that you had the Hebrew words that were written using English letters to try and give an approximate pronunciation of what the Hebrew would perhaps say. And they had a melody that went along with this. That seemed to just kind of surface in recent times. And I was familiar with it because I'd encountered it many times before, but this was their thing, and they liked to do this. But one evening, they couldn't find their card, and this, of course, was before the internet and cell phones, where people could just use their cell phone to find the Aaronic blessing transliterated from Hebrew into English, so they could recite that and close out the service. Instead they had this little card that they would read from, and they couldn't find it. It had disappeared on them, and so they were just looking everywhere, trying to find this card. And they were convinced it was there somewhere. They just couldn't find it. And after about 10 minutes, and I'm thinking, I want to go. I got things to do. It's getting late. So I just offered. I asked them, well, would you like me to give the blessing? I can give the blessing. And they said, oh, sure, yeah, okay, you can do that. Fine, Well, they just didn't know what they were getting themselves into. On this channel that I'm uploading this video to, if you scroll around, you'll find where I did a recording of the Aaronic blessing, and that's exactly what I did there at that congregation. I've done it many, many times. And they had never heard anything like that remotely before, correctly pronounced Hebrew words, a melody that goes back to the time of Christ and before. This was a whole new experience, and people were fundamentally in shock. They really did not have any idea that I was of that caliber. I had been relating to these people for months without expressing to them the magnitude of my experience, of my knowledge base, of how well I knew the Lord, because I would see them as relatively weak believers. So why go in there and bully and intimidate these people? All right? It wouldn't be useful. I'd be violating 1 Corinthians chapter 9 in a sense if I did that. And I was ineffective. And so this was a big surprise. It just was. And so there was such a shock that they asked me if I would maybe start teaching every other week. Share the time with a guy who was there doing the teaching during Friday nights, which was, of course, no good at all. But, I endured it, usually by reading something else while he was doing his thing. But so I did. I started teaching every other week, and they were surprised. They were quite surprised. They had no idea what I could really present. And so it wasn't very long before they asked me to speak every week. And so I taught there every week on this Friday evening service for many months until my life changed dramatically, and I had to leave. And so I did that. But during the time when I was, they told me, okay, listen, Aaron, we just want you to understand that we only have really one requirement, and that is that you stay consistent with the rabbinical schedule of going through the first 5 books of Moses in a year. That's our weekly schedule of what we're going to present. And so there was a schedule with a weekly reading of what passages. I said, sure, fine, great. So I just, whatever passage it was on the schedule for the calendar for that year, for that week, that's what I taught on. And of course, it was within the law. And well, they wanted the law. I gave them the law. I did. I taught the law. I taught the law so well that you could see these people actually, and they gave me 30 minutes. You could see them sink into their chairs, okay, for about the first 20 minutes as I would beat them down with God, condemns you kind of thing. Repent and obey. I gave it to them. And then And then for the last 10 minutes, I would then switch to the New Testament, and I would show them the fulfillment of those laws, all right, and to help them understand how God was using them in order to draw a person to himself and move them into the new life in the new covenant of grace. And you could see them kind of rise up in their chairs a little bit from those last 10 minutes, and it wasn't unusual for them to get up and give me an applause after I was done, after I hit the 30-minute mark or so. And this went on for a long time, until my life changed and I had to depart. But I'm saying this in order to give you an example, and this is kind of a profound example, relatively speaking, of going out into the world and reaching people where they are. Okay, reaching people where they are. And of course, I had lots of practice with individuals and other small groups and small studies before I went into something that was of that magnitude. And it was a pretty good sized group when I first started, and it moved to like 4 to 6 times that size by the time I had left. It had grown. And then, of course, it declined when I left, but that's just normal. It's just kind of the way it goes. But it gave me a chance to reach out to people. Now, did I really have an effect on anybody's life that they really know the gospel of grace and they know the difference of living by the Spirit as opposed to living by the law? Was there anyone there who really got what I was really getting at? I honestly don't know. I would say probably not. There may have been 1 or 2, perhaps, but I don't really know. And I never pursued that to find out if I had any real significant impact on anybody's life. And that was what also made it easier for me to depart. Because did anybody really get it? I don't know. But I did my thing. They did their thing. And that's the message, is that we might reach some. It's not going to be all. This is about reaching out to some, that some might believe, that some might be saved. And maybe it would be 5 years later or 10 years later that some of those people would actually start to think more seriously about some of the things that I said, and maybe it would draw them closer to the Lord. Maybe not. But what's important is that I felt that the Lord sent me to go do that. And I did that. I was free to do that. And I decided, okay, that's what I'll do. And then I was free to leave, and I left and moved on to other things. So with that, let me back up again at verse 19 to give you a little bit of a better sense for this. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. In this example that I gave you, I went to I would call them Jew wannabes, okay? Because none of them were Jewish, but they were pretending like they were. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, they were definitely trying to place themselves and live under the law to an extent, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Okay, that I might. Doesn't mean I will, but I might. Okay? To those who are without law, as without law. Going to verse 22, to the weak I became as weak. I've given you an example of that I might win the weak. Doesn't mean I will, but that I might. Okay, that I might. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. So to become all things to all men means you take others into consideration. Doesn't mean you have to change who you are. I didn't change anything about who I was. I just, related to them in a way that was more consistent with how they would be able to receive what it was that I was able to relate to them. Verse 23, now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be, verse 22, to finish verse 22, to the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Does not mean you're going to save all. It's about the some. Okay? It's just about, well, whomever. And understand that it's going to be unlikely that it will be more than just some, more than just a few. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Okay, inviting them, in effect, to participate in sharing the gospel with other people, to be a partaker of it with them. It's a subtle way of inviting them. You can partake in this with me by you go out and you reach people who are under the law, not under the law, weak, strong, whatever, whoever. But to do so that you might save some. Okay, whoever and however many that may be, that you might save some. Okay, I'm going to pause here and then I'll continue into verse 24 in the next message. For those of you who are using this for small groups, I got a question that can provoke some interesting conversation. What can you do to meet new people? I think it's a good question in this context. What can you do in order to meet new people? All right, you got to be meeting new people in some way, because if you're not, well, then you're stuck with people who you already know. And if you're going to save some, okay, and you already know these people, you've already been relating to them, it doesn't take years and years before you have effectively communicated the Lord to the people who you know. So how are you meeting new people? What can you do in order to meet new people? And if you can do nothing presently, then what can you do so that you can go out and meet new people? All right? What can you do? And I'll continue in the next message. Thanks.